Bucharest, December 21st, 1989. 8 minutes into the speech, the crowd began to boo. Nicolae Ceaușescu had been speaking from the Central Committee balcony for approximately 8 minutes. The crowd in Palace Square below him, assembled by the party apparatus in the specific way that crowds had been assembled in Palace Square for 24 years, through the workplace and school and neighborhood organizations that the party used to populate such occasions with the bodies that such occasions required, had been producing the sound it was always produced to produce, the rhythmic chanting, the applause, the performed enthusiasm that the occasion's script required. Then something changed. The sound that changed it came from the back of the square, from the section furthest from the balcony, where the party's control of individual behavior was weakest, where the Securitate agents, seeded through the crowd for exactly the purpose of preventing this kind of change, had the most difficulty monitoring the people around them. It was not loud initially. It was the sound of a small number of voices doing something that voices in Palace Square had not done in 24 years of Ceaușescu's rule. They were booing. The microphones on the balcony picked it up. The loudspeakers distributed it across the square. The national television broadcast that was carrying the speech live received it, and the director in the control room, watching the feed, watching Ceaușescu's face change, watching the microphone pick up the sound that the microphone was not supposed to pick up, made a decision. He cut the feed. The broadcast went to a static holding image for approximately 2 minutes. Across Romania, the people watching the live broadcast of the General Secretary's address to the people of Bucharest saw the broadcast cut and understood in the specific way that people watching state television understand things that state television does not intend to communicate, that something had happened that the state television system had decided it could not show. The 2 minutes were enough. When the feed resumed, the situation on the balcony and in the square had changed in ways that the resumed broadcast could not conceal. Ceaușescu was still at the microphone. He was saying "Allo, hello," the word a man uses when a connection he thought was established has failed. He raised his hand, the gesture of a man appealing for quiet from an audience that has not given him quiet, and the gesture was visible to the national audience watching the resumed broadcast, and the gesture communicated what it communicated, that the square was not quiet, that the audience was not compliant, that something was happening that the hand gesture could not stop. He went inside. Romania's revolution, which would take 10 days from its beginning in Timișoara to its conclusion in a courtyard in Târgoviște, had begun from a microphone in 8 minutes, from the specific sound of a small number of voices at the back of a square that had decided, in the specific atmosphere of December 1989, in which the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Czechoslovak communist government had resigned, and the Bulgarian Communist Party had removed its leader and the Soviet bloc was visibly dissolving, had decided that the sound the square was supposed to make was no longer the sound the square was going to make. This is the story of the 72 hours that followed, not the revolution in its full complexity. The full account of Romania's revolution requires the months before it and the years before those months, and the specific texture of a 24-year dictatorship that produced the specific population that produced the specific revolution it produced. That is a longer account. This is the 72 hours from the balcony on December 21st to the courtyard on December 25th, and what happened inside that interval, and what the interval reveals about what a dictatorship actually is when the moment arrives in which it stops being able to sustain itself. The moment on the balcony was not the beginning of the revolution. It was the moment the revolution became visible from the inside, became visible to the people who were watching Romanian state television across the country, to the army officers in their barracks who were watching what was happening in Bucharest, to the Securitate commanders who were receiving reports of what the crowds in the square were doing, to the party officials who had spent 24 years understanding that the system's continuation depended on the performance of the crowd, and were now watching the performance fail in real time on national television. The beginning had been Timișoara. Timișoara is Romania's third largest city in the western part of the country near the Serbian and Hungarian borders, and it had been the site, since December 15th, 1989, of protests that had begun around a specific event, the eviction order against Laszlo Tokes, a reformed church pastor who had been outspoken about the regime's treatment of the Hungarian minority in Romania and whose congregation and supporters had gathered outside his apartment to prevent his removal. What began as a gathering in support of a pastor became something larger because of what the regime's response made it into. The Securitate and police forces that arrived to disperse the gathering used force, and the force was visible to the people around it, and the visibility of the force in the specific atmosphere of December 1989, in which the populations of Eastern Europe were watching each other's governments fall and were performing the specific calculation of how much force a government was willing to use and whether that force was more or less than the population was willing to absorb, converted a gathering into a protest, and a protest into something that required a different order of response. Ceaușescu was in Iran on a state visit when the protests in Timișoara began on December 16th. He returned to Romania on December 20th. The reports he had received during the Iranian visit were the reports that the system delivered to him, filtered through the specific mechanisms that any authoritarian system uses to deliver information to the man at its center, mechanisms that have a systematic bias toward softening the assessments that would disturb the man receiving them and toward confirming the assessments that are consistent with his existing framework. His existing framework told him that the disturbances in Timișoara were the work of foreign agents, Hungarian irredentists, Western intelligence services, the specific category of external conspiracy that the regime had always used to explain internal dissent in a way that made the dissent the evidence of external attack rather than internal failure. He returned to Romania believing that the Timișoara disturbances were manageable, that a firm response combined with the specific demonstration of popular support that the December 21st Bucharest rally was designed to provide would re-establish the conditions of stability. The firm response in Timișoara had already produced the opposite of what a firm response was supposed to produce. The army and the Securitate forces deployed in Timișoara had fired on demonstrators on December 17th. The shooting had killed people. The exact number is disputed, with estimates ranging from tens to hundreds, the uncertainty reflecting both the chaos of the events and the subsequent difficulty of establishing the facts in a country whose record-keeping was organized around concealing rather than documenting the activities of the security forces. The shooting had not dispersed the protests. It had expanded them. By December 20th, when Ceaușescu returned to Bucharest, the military commander in Timișoara had issued a statement declaring that the army would not fire on Romanian citizens. This was the first statement of its kind in the history of the Ceaușescu regime. It was also the first crack in the structure that the 72 hours would open completely. The army and the Securitate were not the same institution, and the difference between them is essential to understanding what happened between December 21st and December 25th. The Securitate, Romania's secret police, with its network of informants and its domestic surveillance apparatus, and its specific organizational identity as the regime's primary instrument of political control, was, institutionally and by the nature of its function, the regime's creature. Its officers had built careers inside the system. Their advancement had depended on the system's continuation, and their institutional identity was organized around the protection of the system in a way that made the system's fall their fall. The army was different. Not because the army was opposed to the regime, it was not, or had not been, and its senior officers had accommodated themselves to the regime in the ways that military establishments accommodate themselves to the political systems they serve. But the army's institutional identity was organized around a different proposition from the Securitats, organized around the defense of Romania rather than the defense of the party's rule of Romania. And when the difference between those two propositions became undeniable, when the army was being asked to fire on Romanian citizens in Romanian streets, the army's institutional identity provided a framework for refusal that the Securitats' institutional identity did not. The Timișoara commander's December 20th statement was the first expression of that framework. It would not be the last. Ceaușescu went to the balcony on December 21st, not knowing that the framework had begun to shift. He believed, or had decided to believe, that the rally would demonstrate what the rallies had always demonstrated, that the people of Romania supported him, that the party's relationship with the population was intact, that the specific performance of collective enthusiasm that 24 years of party management of public gatherings had produced could be produced again. He underestimated two things. He underestimated the degree to which the people being assembled in Palace Square were not the people who had been assembled in Palace Square in previous years, not because they were different people, but because December 1989 was not a previous year, and the specific quality of a crowd's decision to perform the required enthusiasm is a quality that is sensitive to the atmosphere in which the performance is requested, and the atmosphere of December 21st, 1989, in a country where the neighboring country's communist governments had been falling for 2 months and where Timișoara was known through the information channels that official concealment could not entirely block, the Radio Free Europe broadcasts, the word of mouth, the specific networks of information that closed systems cannot fully close, was not the atmosphere of any previous year. He underestimated the power of the moment itself. The moment in which the sound from the back of the square reached the microphones, and the microphones broadcast it, and the director cut the feed, and the country watching the cut feed understood what the cut meant. That moment was not recoverable. It had happened. It was in the broadcast record. It had been seen by the people watching, and the people watching included the army officers in their barracks, and the Securitate commanders in their offices, and the party officials in their buildings. And all of them had seen the same thing. The crowd had booed, and the response had been to cut the broadcast, which was itself the confirmation that the booing was real. He spent the night in the Central Committee building. He held emergency meetings. He spoke by phone with military commanders and Securitate chiefs and party officials. He gave orders. The orders were for the deployment of forces, for the restoration of order, for the application of the firm response that the system had always applied, and that the system had always, until Timișoara, succeeded in applying. The orders were not fully executed in the way they were given. This is the specific thing that happened on the night of December 21st to December 22nd, and it is the thing that determined everything that followed. The orders went to the army and the Securitate and the police, and the response to the orders was not uniform. The Securitate units in Bucharest acted. Army units in some locations complied. In others, did not. In others, complied initially, and stopped when compliance required firing on the crowds that had gathered in the streets of Bucharest after the events of the afternoon. The crowds were not dispersing, they were growing. The crowd growth was itself a demonstration. People who had watched the broadcast and had seen the feed cut and had understood what the cut meant were coming into the streets, which is what people do when they have decided that the act of coming into the streets is less dangerous than the act of staying inside, and pretending that what they have just seen has not changed the calculation. The calculation had changed. The streets of Bucharest on the night of December 21st to 22nd were the physical expression of that change. The people who had decided that the moment had arrived in which being in the street was the available option. The shootings that night killed people. The exact numbers remained disputed in the years after the revolution, with the initial reports of thousands of dead in Bucharest being subsequently revised downward significantly as the evidence was examined. The truth being that the violence, while real and deadly, was substantially less than the first account suggested, and the subsequent difficulty of establishing accurate figures reflected both the chaos of the events and the way in which the revolution's mythology organized around the highest casualty figures, rather than the most accurate ones. People died. The shootings were real. Whether the shooters were Securitate units loyal to the regime, or provocateurs, or army units who misunderstood their orders, or some combination of all three, is a question that the Romanian investigation of the revolution has been attempting to answer for decades and has not fully answered, because the events of those nights involved multiple armed actors in a chaotic environment, and the documentary record of who shot whom and on whose orders is incomplete. What is documented is the morning of December 22nd. Ceaușescu appeared on the Central Committee balcony again. He had been told that the army was with him, or he had told himself that the army was with him, or he had decided that appearing on the balcony was the available response to the situation, regardless of what the army was doing, because the balcony was what he had, and the alternative, not appearing, acknowledging that the situation had moved beyond the balcony's reach, was not a position that his particular psychology and his particular understanding of power could access. He appeared. The crowd in the square was not the crowd of December 21st. The crowd of December 22nd was not assembled by the party apparatus. It was the crowd that had assembled itself, which was a different crowd in every sense that mattered, different in its composition, different in its mood, different in the specific quality of its relationship to the man on the balcony, which was not the performed enthusiasm of the assembled crowd, but something that did not have a name in the 24-year vocabulary of Palace Square occasions, because it had not previously existed in that vocabulary. The crowd was telling him to leave. He tried to speak. The noise from the square was not the noise that Palace Square was supposed to make, and was not manageable by the instruments he had always used to manage it. He raised his hands. He appealed for quiet, in the way that he had appealed for quiet the previous day. The quiet did not come. He went inside for the last time. The helicopter was already on the roof. It had been put there, positioned on the roof of the Central Committee building, as a precaution or as a contingency, or as the specific preparation of a man who understood that a moment might come in which the building's roof was the only available exit. It had been there before the December 21st rally. It was still there on the morning of December 22nd. The existence of the helicopter on the roof is itself a document, evidence that the Ceaușescus had, at some level below the level of conscious acknowledgement, already incorporated into their planning the possibility that the balcony might not be enough. He and Elena Ceaușescu and 2 other passengers boarded the helicopter at approximately noon on December 22nd. The helicopter lifted off from the roof of the Central Committee building. The people in the square below could see it lifting. The national television cameras that had been brought to the square could record it lifting, and they did, and the footage of the helicopter lifting from the roof became one of the defining images of the Romanian Revolution, the specific visual confirmation that the man who had ruled Romania for 24 years was leaving, was gone, was in the air above the city that was now without him. The crowd in the square erupted. The pilot of the helicopter was Colonel Vasile Maluțan. He has given various accounts over the years of what happened during the flight and what his instructions were and what he understood his options to be. What is clear from the available accounts is that the helicopter was tracked by the Romanian military, that the military's air defense systems were in a state of alert, that a signal had been given, or a miscommunication had occurred, or a deliberate decision had been made, depending on whose account you accept, that produced, at some point during the flight, the communication to Maluțan that he needed to land. He landed at a military facility, then continued. He landed again near Târgoviște. He landed a 3rd time near Târgoviște, and the Ceaușescus got out of the helicopter and were taken into custody, first at a military facility in Târgoviște, held in conditions that the accounts describe as the specific confusion of a military establishment that was receiving a former head of state who was now a prisoner and that had not been given clear instructions about what to do with him. They were held in a building. They were moved between locations within the facility. They asked questions. Elena asked more questions than Nicolae, by most accounts demanded answers, with the specific authority of a woman who had spent decades having her demands for answers produce answers, and the answers they received were incomplete or evasive or simply absent, because the people holding them were themselves in the process of determining what was happening outside the facility and what their own position was, and what was going to happen to the people they were holding. What was happening outside the facility was the revolution completing itself. Bucharest was in the process of what the subsequent analysis described variously as a continuation of genuine revolutionary action and a managed transfer of power by elements of the Communist Party and military establishment, who had calculated that the moment had arrived to position themselves on the side of the revolution rather than the side of the regime. The National Salvation Front, the body that emerged in the hours of December 22nd as the governing authority that was claiming to represent the revolution, was composed of men who had been, in various ways and at various levels of commitment, inside the system they were now claiming to have overthrown. Ion Iliescu, who became the president of the National Salvation Front and subsequently of Romania, had been a senior Communist Party official who had been marginalized by Ceaușescu in the 1970s. Petre Roman, who became prime minister, was the son of a Communist Party official. The composition of the National Salvation Front was, from the first days, a source of controversy that the subsequent decades of Romanian political life have not resolved. The question of whether the revolution was a genuine popular uprising that was then managed by Communist Party insiders for their own purposes, or a genuine popular uprising that produced a new government that included the only people available with the administrative capacity to govern, or some combination that does not resolve cleanly into either of those descriptions. What is not controversial is the street. The street was genuine. The people in Timișoara on December 16th and 17th were genuine. The people in Palace Square on December 21st who began to boo were genuine. The people who came out of their apartments and houses and into the streets of Bucharest on the night of December 21st to 22nd were genuine. The people who died, the specific people, with names and families and specific circumstances of death, were genuine. The revolution was real. What it produced and who organized the production, and whether the organization was the revolution or the management of the revolution, is a question the Romanians have been living inside since December 1989 and have not finished answering. The trial. On December 25, 1989, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were tried by a military tribunal in a room in the military facility in Târgoviște, where they had been held since December 22nd. The trial lasted approximately 1 hour. 1 hour for 24 years of rule, for the Securitate and its informant network, for the forced demolition of historic buildings, and the construction of the Palace of the People, the second largest administrative building in the world, still standing in Bucharest, built at a cost that the Romanian economy could not afford and that the Romanian people had not chosen, for the austerity programs of the 1980s that had exported food while Romanians queued for bread, for the payments of Romania's foreign debt that had been completed at the cost of electricity rationed to a few hours per day, of heating cut to temperatures that the elderly and the sick could not survive, of a standard of living that had declined throughout the decade while the official pronouncements maintained that socialism was building the radiant future, for the shootings in Timișoara, for the shootings in Bucharest, for the people who had died in the streets of those cities in the preceding 10 days. 1 hour. The tribunal was a panel of military officers, and the proceeding had the form of a legal trial. Charges, responses, a verdict, a sentence, without the substance of one, which is to say without the time, or the resources, or the procedural protections that a legal trial requires to be something other than a performance. The Romanian lawyers who subsequently analyzed the trial's record characterized it as a proceeding that was organized around a predetermined outcome and that used the form of legal process to provide the predetermined outcome with the appearance of legitimacy. The predetermined outcome was death. The charges were genocide, the killings in Timișoara and Bucharest, and sabotage of the economy and state institutions, and undermining of state power. Ceaușescu refused to recognize the authority of the tribunal. He said he would only speak before the Grand National Assembly. He repeated this several times. Elena said the charges were absurd. She said this with the specific indignation of a woman who had spent decades being told she was the mother of Romania and who was now being told she was a criminal, and the gap between those two descriptions was not one that she had prepared for or could bridge in the hour available. The prosecution presented its charges. The defense, such as it was, offered responses that were not engaged with by the tribunal in the manner that responses in a functioning legal proceeding are engaged with. The tribunal withdrew. The tribunal returned. The verdict was guilty on all counts. The sentence was death. They were taken outside. The courtyard of the military facility in Târgoviște is a concrete space. The wall of the courtyard. The December sky. The firing squad of soldiers who had been selected from the men available at the facility. Nicolae Ceaușescu began to sing the Internationale, the socialist anthem, as the soldiers prepared. He managed several lines of it. Elena said something to the soldiers that the accounts record differently, the words varying between versions in a way that reflects either the difficulty of hearing clearly in the circumstances or the subsequent tendency of accounts of extreme moments to organize themselves around the most resonant available version. What the accounts agree on is that she spoke, and that what she said expressed something about the relationship between herself and the people who were about to kill her that was in the register of outrage rather than supplication. they were shot. It was Christmas Day, 1989. Nicolae Ceaușescu was 71 years old. Elena Ceaușescu was 73. The footage of their bodies was broadcast on Romanian national television that evening. The broadcast was, in the specific context of Romanian society in December 1989, a deliberate act, a demonstration that the thing that had been the center of Romanian political and social life for 24 years was over, that the bodies were real, that the people had not been misled about the fact of the death in the way that the people had been misled about so many things across the preceding decades. The filming of the bodies and the broadcasting of the footage has been subsequently criticized on legal grounds, on human rights grounds, on the grounds that the decision to execute without a proper trial violated the specific procedural protections that even the worst criminals are entitled to, and that the broadcasting of the bodies of the executed violated additional protections. These criticisms are grounded in principles that are not contingent on the identity of the people to whom they apply. The criticism that the trial was not a proper trial is accurate. The criticism that the execution was rushed is accurate. The accuracy of the criticism does not alter what the Ceaușescus were responsible for. The accuracy of the criticism is about the process through which they were held responsible, not about whether they were responsible. The distinction matters. The question of whether the Christmas Day trial was justice is a different question from the question of whether the people who were tried deserved to be held accountable for what they had done, and the two questions require separate answers. The answer to the first question is, it was not justice in the procedural sense that the word justice requires. The answer to the second question is, they did. The Romanian Revolution of December 1989 produced a kind of accounting that was faster and more violent and less procedurally sound than the accountings that other transitions from communist rule produced in the same period. Poland had the Round Table Agreement. Czechoslovakia had the Velvet Revolution and Václav Havel, and a transfer of power conducted through negotiation and demonstrated popular pressure. East Germany had the wall falling and the subsequent absorption into the Federal Republic. Hungary had a negotiated transition. Bulgaria removed Todor Zhivkov and began a process of reform. Romania had 10 days and a courtyard. The difference reflects the difference between the regimes that were being replaced. The Polish and Czech and Hungarian and East German regimes had accommodated themselves, however uncomfortably, to a degree of civic society and intellectual life that provided the organizations and the figures around which a negotiated transition could organize. Ceaușescu's Romania had suppressed civic society more completely, had built a surveillance state more pervasive, had made the security more present in daily life, had permitted less of the intellectual and organizational space that a negotiated transition requires than the other regimes of the Soviet bloc. There was no Polish solidarity in Romania. There was no Czech Charter 77. There was no network of underground organizations and samizdat publications and church communities that existed as an alternative to the state and could become the visible leadership of a transition. What there was in December 1989 was a population that had been living under the specific conditions of Ceaușescu's Romania for 24 years, conditions that had produced, by December 1989, a collective willingness to take to the streets that did not require organizational infrastructure, that required only the specific moment when the performance of compliance was no longer the available option. The balcony provided the moment. The army provided the mechanism. The army's turn, the specific, documented, historically significant decision of the Romanian military to withdraw its support from the Ceaușescu regime and to position itself as the protector of the revolution rather than the enforcer of the regime, is the event that the title of this account names and that the account has been building to. It did not happen on a single night. It happened across the days between December 16th and December 22nd. Through the accumulation of decisions made by specific officers at specific levels of the military hierarchy, from the Timișoara commander's December 20th statement that the army would not fire on citizens to the decisions of the helicopter pilot and the officers at the military facilities where the Ceaușescus were held, and the decisions of the officers in Bucharest who, on the night of December 21st to 22nd, did not fully execute the orders to restore order by the means the orders specified. The turn was not unanimous. Some army units did fire. The complexity of the events in Bucharest on the nights of December 21st and 22nd, the conflicting accounts of who shot whom and why, the subsequent investigations that have attempted to establish the facts and have not fully succeeded, the ongoing legal proceedings that have occupied Romanian courts for decades, reflects the fact that the army's turn was not a single decision made at a single moment by a unified institution, but a series of decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances, with specific information and specific calculations of what the situation required and what their obligations were and what the consequences of different choices would be. What the turn produced in its aggregate effect across the 72 hours from December 21st to December 25th was a regime that had lost the instrument through which it had maintained itself. Ceaușescu had built his power on the specific combination of the Securitate and the army and the party apparatus, and the Securitate was built on the army's cooperation, and the party apparatus was built on the Securitate's effectiveness. And when the army's cooperation withdrew, not completely, not uniformly, but sufficiently, the structure that depended on it could not sustain itself. It had taken 24 years to build. It took 72 hours to fall. The Palace of the People still stands in Bucharest. It is called the Palace of the Parliament now. It is the second largest administrative building in the world. It was built at a cost that is estimated, the estimates vary, and the records are incomplete, at somewhere between $3 and $9 billion, at a time when the Romanian GDP per capita was being reduced by the austerity programs that were repaying the foreign debt while the building's construction consumed resources that could have provided heating and food and the ordinary material conditions of a livable life. The building is enormous. The scale of it, the number of rooms, the size of the rooms, the marble and the crystal and the wood paneling and the specific quality of excess that the interior represents is the physical record of what a dictatorship is willing to consume in the service of its own mythology. It receives visitors. There are tours. The courtyard in Târgoviște, where the Ceaușescus were shot, is also available to visitors. There is a plaque. The wall is still there. The balcony on the Central Committee building is still there. The building is now the Interior Ministry. The balcony is still there, and the square below it is still called Revolution Square, and the specific location where the microphones picked up the booing on December 21st, 1989, where a small number of voices at the back of an assembled crowd decided that the sound the square was supposed to make was not the sound the square was going to make, is indistinguishable now from the rest of the square. The sound was there. It changed everything. 8 minutes into a speech, a microphone, a director who cut the feed, a helicopter on a roof, a courtyard on Christmas Day. 24 years ended in 72 hours. The army turned, the wall, the courtyard. Romania is still trying to fully understand what happened in those 72 hours, still working through the court cases and the investigations and the historical debates about who shot whom and who ordered what and whether the revolution was managed from inside or erupted from the street, or was some combination that resists the clean description that either account provides. The working through continues. The investigations continue. The court cases continue. The balcony is still there. The square is still called Revolution Square. The booing happened. Everything that followed from the booing. That much is not in dispute. That much is in the record, permanently, as the specific moment when the performance of a 24-year dictatorship encountered the refusal of the audience to perform its part, and the dictatorship did not survive the refusal. It could not. Nothing built on performance survives when the audience stops performing. This one lasted 8 minutes into the last speech. 8 minutes. Then the microphone picked it up. Then the whole thing fell.